by introducing ourselves, but I've been told that that introduction should come with a disclaimer and a warning. We're actually both members of Gen Y, so if you're at the presentation yesterday, I see a few familiar faces about Gen Y in the boardroom, you should be warned that we are Gen Y members. My name's Ruth. I'm the president of the YWCA of Canberra, so that means I'm also the board chair. I've been on the board for 5 years now, and in that time I've also been vice president and chair of some of our subcommittees. In my day job, I work as a consultant for a company that does monitoring and evaluation, and some of our recent projects have been about helping very small, remote not-for-profit boards with their governance.
And I'm Jo Allebone. I'm Vice President of the YWCA of Canberra. I've been on the board for about 2 years, and I'm also the chair of our memberships committee, and I'm a member of our nominations and remuneration committee. In my day job, I manage strategic communication for a not-for-profit organisation called the Foundation for Alcohol Research and Education, otherwise known as FAIR. And I'm really pleased to be here to chat with you all today.
So the origins of this presentation actually came from last year's Better Boards conference when we came to present on our board traineeship program, and we'd be more than happy to chat to you for hours on end in the breaks about our board traineeship program. But essentially it involves getting women with no board experience to come and be observers on the board for a year. So we do some mentoring and some workshops as well, but the key part is really learning by observing board practice. And one of the added benefits of having a board traineeship program is that there's a subtle positive pressure on the board to have best practice if you're then having people sitting there observing you. And so I was telling people about that last year and saying it means that we're always trying to learn more. That's why we come to these kind of conferences. And we have things in place that we think are best practice for boards. So we have an orientation day each year. That's we encourage all new board members and old board members to come along. We have an annual planning day. We have a very clear governance manual. We have a register of interest at the start of every meeting, and we have a 15-year strategic plan. And I'd be telling people about this in the breaks and be like, we have an orientation day, and they'd be like, yep. And we have, a register of interest, and they say, yeah. And so we have a 15-year strategic plan, and they'd say, you have a what? And people some people were really positive, and some people said, yes, my organisation also has this kind of long-term plan. But some people looked at me like I was crazy, and they said, you have a 15-year plan, really? And some people were actually quite negative about it. And in my conversations with other directors and getting to know other people in the not-for-profit sector, and even talking to people involved in small businesses, people would say to me, oh, surely you can't have a 15-year strategic plan. It must be all motherhood statements. Or another comment I had was, you couldn't do that. That's fine for you guys, but we couldn't do that. There's too much change in our sector. We do a lot of work in childcare, so let me tell you, there's a lot of change in our sector as well. So I've been on various management committees and involved with boards before, but the YWCA of Canberra is my first real board experience. And I never questioned that we had a 15-year strategic plan. We always question elements of the plan at our annual planning days, like reviewing and revising what we're doing. But I never questioned why we have a 15-year plan or how it came to be. And so dealing with these kind of comments about why do you do that, I've decided to investigate it a bit more. And so I've been talking to a lot of people about how we came up with the plan. We've been interviewing past board members. We've been looking at the old documents to really get an understanding of how we came to have this long-term plan and what it's meant for the organisation. And in doing that, we thought, well, it would make a good case study for the Better Boards conference. So that's what we're here to tell you about.
So in the presentation today, we're going to talk to you a little bit about, as Ruth said, our board's role in strategic planning. And we're also going to introduce the YWCA of Canberra for those of you that aren't familiar with the organisation, just to give a bit of background. But our real focus, as Ruth alluded to, is telling you the story of why and how we've developed the 15-year strategic plan, what it's meant for the organisation, and where we are now as an organisation. And throughout, we'll mention some of the lessons that we think are worth sharing with you all. And we'd also like it if you do interrupt us. That's totally fine, and ask questions, so just raise your hand and we'll try and get around to everybody. And at the end, we'd really like to have an open discussion if we have time. So we'll get on with it now.
So just very briefly, I just thought it was worth mentioning that we are basing this presentation on the assumption that strategic planning is important and that strategic planning is part of the board's role. I think I've seen some debate in the literature about the extent to which strategic planning is solely the responsibility of the board or a shared responsibility with staff, but I think it's just important to mention that increasingly there's an emphasis on not-for-profits having strong professional boards, and often boards that follow a policy governance model or a carver governance model. And in this kind of model, strategic planning is a core skill of directors, and it's clearly the role of the board to set the strategic plan of the organisation and stay out of operations. And if you are at the ACNC stand today and you pick up their Governance for Good guide, you'll find that on page 5 it says that strategy, which is setting the organisation's long-term goals and making sure it pursues its charitable purpose, is one of the common responsibilities of a board. So I found a report on ourcommunity.com.au that reports on a study that found that organisations that do have a strategic plan are more effective than those who didn't. And it found that 31% of not-for-profits had a strategic plan. And that means that 69% of not-for-profits at the time of the study did not have a strategic plan. So given that it's a core responsibility of directors, it's a bit of a worry. But you can see why, because it can be very difficult to focus on long-term planning and strategic planning in a time of rapid change. It can be difficult when you're not sure where your funding's coming from to start thinking about a long-term future. And a lot of the small rural not-for-profits that I've been talking to in my day job have said to me, the thing we're most proud of in our organisation is that the doors are still open. You know, we're struggling to operate day to day. How can we even think about a longer term plan? And we also acknowledge that most NGOs are time and resource poor. So even if you're a bigger and more financially viable organisation, there's always a lot of need, there's always a shortage of time, and most board directors are volunteers. So we do acknowledge that it's a challenging issue. But strategic planning is about deciding what to do and what not to do and where to prioritise your resources. So it is very important. And boards should determine what the most important issues and goals and objectives are for their organisation and craft a plan around those.
So just to set the scene a little bit more, I'm going to share with you a bit of background about the Y, as we affectionately call it. So the YWCA of Canberra is a values-led, non-for-profit, community-based organisation with a long history of serving the Canberra community. Our organisation is a member of our national body, which is the YWCA of Australia, and the Y of Australia is in turn a member of the World YWCA. Our vision is women achieving their potential, and our purpose is, through the leadership of women and girls, the YWCA of Canberra is building a better community for all. The ACNC would actually classify us as a large not-for-profit. We've got around 300 employees, many of which are casual or part-time, and we have an annual income of about $10 million. Our work includes housing and homelessness services such as supported tenancies, childcare, and youth engagement and literacy programs. We run long daycare centres, outside school hours care and family daycare, and we're a registered training organisation, so we run really cool workshops and courses in-house on childcare training and leadership. We're also very engaged in advocacy on women's human rights issues at the state, national and international level. And just last Sunday, I came back from a 3-week internship in Geneva with the UN Human Rights Council, and we were dealing with issues there such as sexual and reproductive health rights, women's human rights in general, and issues like child early and forced marriage. So our local Y is active both in local space and in the international space, which is really cool. In terms of our governance arrangements, we've got quite a large board, so we have 12 members. And for the most part, we follow the Carver model, as Ruth mentioned, but there are a few modifications, like our ED is actually a member of the board as well. And our board comprises women from a whole range of professional backgrounds, including law, finance, community development, policy and advocacy, marketing and communication, and federal and state government employees. An interesting aspect of our board, and we would again be happy to chat with you about this in the break, is that we actually have a constitutional requirement for 30% of our board positions to be held by young women. And all of our board members are elected by our membership for a 3-year term initially, and then they can be re-elected for a second 3-year term. But after that, they need to have at least 1 year off and go and do other things if they want to come back again. So these term limits, plus the fact that in Canberra we have a really fluctuating kind of population, people come and go, means that there's currently no one on our board that was actually present at the time at which this long-term strategic plan was developed, apart from our ED, whose last day was actually on Friday. So there's
now
really no
as
one.
of Monday, there really is no one on the board who was there for the strategic planning.
Yeah.
Yes.
Can you explain the difference between W and M? Which isn't
It's not.
YMCA.
Yeah, It's
Candidates for both sexes.
it's not a
I think
stupid
it's YWCA is purely female.
Oh, right, sorry, I was going to say yes. W for women, M for men.
Got
Got that one? Yeah, so if you need more detail on that one, I need to refer you on.
That's a different conference.
Different conference.
Yeah.
No, so with the W, we really do focus around women's leadership. Our board is women, and a lot of programs are around women's rights and reproductive health rights and those kind of things. But our services are, childcare is for women and for men. Our relationship things, I'll take it back here. Relationship things is a education program. Education program for high school students around respectful relationships and safe sex. So that's for both genders. Some of our programs are specifically for women. So, for example, we run a Women Out Front program, which is about encouraging women onto boards. We run Every Girl, that program, which is a citizenship program for young girls. So some of our programs are for everyone, but a lot of them have a specific gendered focus.
And we do have male members, so feel free to join.
Yeah, we have male members. Great. Okay, so this is just a snapshot of our roadmap, and we do like to have it as a picture with roads and a very visual kind of image. But this is just a snapshot A4 page that you can get it all on, and it is accompanied by a description, quite a detailed description of where we see Canberra in 2022 and where we see our organisation's role in that community and how we see ourselves serving and supporting that community. And as you can see, there's the 5-year milestones that we aim to achieve along the way. And I'll talk a bit more about this later. Given that neither of us were actually on the board for the strategic planning process, we went back to a lot of the original documents, which are still held by the organisation, and looked at the process that was followed. And we also interviewed a lot of former board members about their experiences of planning and their reflections on it. So we've set the scene of who we are and what we do as an organisation, but to set the scene of what was going on when somebody comes to your board meeting and says, I think we need a 15-year plan. So I was wondering, what leads someone to do that and say, yep, okay, what we want to do is a long-term plan. So we've got some quotes here from the interviews that we did with former board members. And one of those was that I think the fact that we're a long-term organisation influenced our thinking. We've had our 80th birthday a couple of years ago. At the time of developing the strategic plan, they were starting to write the organisation's history, and so having celebrated the 75th birthday and starting to move towards the 80th, they were looking through a lot of old documents. There was a lot of looking through our old annual reports and getting a sense of the kind of challenges that had faced the organisation in the past. And this board member we were talking to said, look, it wasn't explicit in our discussions. We never said this is why we're doing it. But they said that there was definitely an atmosphere of understanding how the organisation had become such a long-lived organisation. And saying that one of the keys to success was that we're an organisation that evolves with the community. And saying if we want to honour this, we need to understand the community and what the future challenges are. To set the context as well, we did already have a clear vision, mission and values. So that kind of planning process had already occurred a long time in the past. And we did have some strategic planning documents. We did have 1-year plans or 3-year plans. There wasn't this broader long-term vision in place. We were fortunate that the organisation was in a fairly settled position at the time. So the ED had been in place for a couple of years, although she was about to go on maternity leave. But that was the situation at the time of starting. And some of the process around why a discussion around long-term plans had started was that they'd resolved the financial situation of the organisation. So there'd been a period where there were a few years of deficits, and working with the finance committee and the organisation to kind of minimise those problems and start to strengthen the financial base of the organisation. And also to look at some of the legacy assets and the legacy funds that we had, and looking at what could be used, and realising that there probably was some money there that could be used, but wanting to get a better idea of how to spend it. The quote here I really like is that we were feeling buffeted by change. There was a lot going on in the community. I see a few people nodding, that feeling of everything is changing all at once, and how is your organisation going to survive at this time of change? And one of those changes was there had been a lot of shifts of the physical location of the organisation. So people were moving a lot. And one of the ideas that was around was, should we maybe buy our own property to have the office in that could also be a community space? And they sort of said, well, look, that's a great idea, but what else could we do? So what else could we do with this money? So that was a sort of idea. If we were going to do this, we needed a broader framework for decision making. A 1-year plan wasn't enough to be looking at how we invest a substantial amount of the organisation's resources. The quote here, there was a danger that we would inadvertently become an organisation that did particular things because we were chasing the tenders. At the time, there'd been some rather large shifts in government funding, and we've actually gone through a really similar period again where the state government in particular has made some really big changes in what they're going to fund and how they're going to fund it, leaving the organisation kind of shifting and saying, well, now that they're not funding that, do we want to go for this new tender or not? What kind of organisation do we want to be? It also turned the organisation to start looking more towards philanthropic trusts, corporate partnerships, those kind of ideas. But it's something that not all board members were feeling comfortable with. So they were saying, well, we don't know what we want to do, and perhaps we need a bigger picture view of what kind of organisation we are and where we're going. So I think a good quote for this is to say that there was a view that things were changing pretty rapidly, and a concern that if we didn't set our own strategic path, the work that we did was in danger of becoming particular things that were being funded, and we wanted to be really conscious in our decision-making process. So that was what was going at the time, and Jo's going to tell you, just sort of summarising what were the factors that led to a 15-year plan.
So I think the first important point is really about taking that long-term view. So as we mentioned, the YWCA as a whole is one of the world's oldest women's organisations, and the YWCA of Canberra has a long history in the Canberra community. But perhaps for a younger organisation, it might be hard to adopt that kind of long-term thinking when undertaking planning or goal setting. But for us, it's really about our connection to our history and our roots that sort of enables us to be able to establish a clear vision for the future. Secondly, it's about really understanding the consequences of pursuing opportunities for opportunity's sake. So as Ruth alluded to, the question that our board was grappling with at that time was really about, what can we do with our money that best helps us achieve our vision, rather than just simply, are we going to invest in a new building, for example? And that kind of a question is really difficult to answer if you're only planning in 2 to 3 year blocks. It was also really crucial for our board at this time to understand that taking up opportunities by government, like tenders, would shape what kind of organisation we were going to be, and that wouldn't necessarily align with our vision and mission. So it was really important for the organisation to resist that pressure, to take up opportunities just because they were there. It's also important to have the space to develop a strategic plan. And by space, what we're talking about are things like having stable finances, having an executive director that had been in that role for a while, but she did actually go on maternity leave in that strategic planning period. Having a functional board dynamic with sound skills in strategic planning, and we were lucky to have all of those elements in place at that point in time. And lastly, it's really about leveraging the opportunities that are presented by uncertainty. This is maybe a bit of a Gen Y point, but it kind of seems counterintuitive at first, because an uncertain environment is usually an excuse to not make time for things like strategic planning. But it's actually one of the best times to think about what you want to do and what kind of an organisation you want to be. So it's important to take the time to consciously invest your organisation's precious resources where they're most needed, according to your organisation's mission and values.
We felt like there's some important sort of overall lessons to share, particularly in the context of sort of the discussions we're having right at the start of the conference around innovation and change and disruptive change with organisations. And that's really important, but I think it's about conscious decision making. So if we were going to make a big change in what we were doing, we wanted to make it very consciously and with a long-term plan, rather than there's a tender available, let's go off in this direction. So I'm going to go through now some of the processes that we followed to develop the 15-year plan. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about specifics, because it's not really about, we don't want to go into detail of what we're about, it's more about just sharing that story of how it occurred and maybe leave you with some ideas for your organisation. So they realised that a 15-year plan would take a lot of work to develop and it would take some time, so they did allow a lot of time for that, and part of allowing that time was about having a working group of the board that was specifically dedicated to planning, and it was known as the Strategic Planning Committee. And I think that gives you a bit of insight into what our board is like. It's a very friendly, welcoming and fun board to be on, but it also includes some very nerdy people who are more than happy to sit on a Strategic Planning Committee, and who quite enjoy spending Saturday nights writing presentations about governance and strategic planning. So we're very fortunate in the board members that we have had over time. So the Strategic Planning Committee discussed different methodologies for planning and for strategic planning for the board, and looked at how they might like to do it. And one of the board members had experience using scenario planning in her work, and just really promoted that as a methodology that would be useful for the organisation. So that's the model they ended up going with. Scenario planning is around looking at what some of the options for the future are, and then writing a strategic plan that will work for those different options. So the really simple example is, in the current political environment, you need a strategic plan that's going to be able to be enacted and robust if you have a Labor government, and it's going to be equally sustainable and robust if you have a Liberal government. It's about not putting all of your eggs into the one basket, but having a strategy for your organisation that will guide you through different alternative futures. So in order to develop some scenarios, you need to do research and really base that on evidence on what's happening in the community. And so the Strategic Planning Committee developed a research brief, and that included questions like, what's the Y of Australia doing and what's the World Y doing to make sure that our local work aligns with the national and world vision? What are the experts saying is going to happen in the ACT in our region? What will it look like by 2020? What's going on? What are the likely areas of need? How can we best serve our community? What's going on in the community sector and the not-for-profit sector? What will that look like in 2020? And what are some of the broader demographic trends across Australia that we should be mindful of? And so this research was used to develop scenarios of change that would affect women and young women in the ACT. And so to give you an example, one of the board members said the statistic that really stuck with her, and she still cites it all the time, is that in the ACT, 50% of the population turn over every 5 years. Well, that was the case in 2007. It might be a lot higher in about a couple of months' time. But there is a high level of population mobility, and people are often going on postings overseas or going overseas for volunteer work, and then they come back. And we certainly experience that on our board with people coming and going but still remaining connected. And so they thought as a board, well, what does that mean for us as an organisation that's about women's leadership and about supporting the community if there's this highly mobile population? And that led to a lot of discussions around the need for sort of surrogate families, the need for community support for women. We were working in childcare at the time, but that really helped us strengthen our position that for us, childcare was a mission-based business, and that it was really important for women to have that support of high-quality community childcare. So that's an example of how the research was used to connect to what we do, and also to think about what we could do in the future. And you'll see when I put the plan back up that resolving our directions around childcare was a key goal by 2012. In developing these scenarios, there was also consultations with our stakeholders, and that included both internal and external stakeholders. So we talked to government, we talked to funders where we could about their opinions about where things were going. Our internal stakeholder consultation included talking to our life members. So these were often women who had been involved with the organisation for a very long time, and gave that perspective of where they saw the organisation going. And then there was a period of talking about key strategic areas on the board agenda over a series of meetings. So it wasn't a rushed process at all. There would be some key strategic questions on each board agenda over a couple of months, and that was in the lead up to having a planning day. And that planning day was a full day process of bringing together everything that was there and developing the roadmap that you saw earlier. So I guess it's just important to say that the strategic plan was based on a really strong evidence-based, and it was also connected to the Y's history.
So if we think about what some of the key messages are from that experience, the first is really about the fact that a strategic plan should be based on a good understanding of the organisation's environment and its community or communities. So to do this, you might commission your own research, but if you don't have money and you can get some volunteers, like all of your wonderful volunteer board directors, there are a lot of publicly available documents through the ABS. There's also a pretty strong movement at the moment, at least that I've noticed in the ACT and nationally, for governments to make data more publicly available so that we actually can drill down into that and better understand the environments that we're working in. You might also want to think about checking out local and state government strategic plans. They can be quite useful. And also take advantage of the people that you have good relationships with. And I know that sounds kind of like common sense, but sometimes we forget about all of those people that we have really good working relationships with. We can actually sit down with them and conduct focus groups or qualitative interviews, and you can speak to Ruth more about that as well because she's the guru at that kind of stuff. The second point is really about scenario planning, and for us that was a really useful tool in developing a strategic plan. So it's really about considering multiple possible futures, obviously not every possible future, but the likely ones, rather than trying to predict the future. And lastly, it's about recognising that to develop a plan, it does require investment. And initially that might just be time and money, but it's also about ensuring that your plan is implemented, monitored and reviewed on a regular basis. But after all, it sounds like a lot of extra work, but it is just kind of our role as directors on boards. And by having that clear long-term plan, it's actually making our jobs a lot easier.
So what our current reporting and planning framework looks like now for the organisation is that we have our vision and mission and values, so that's really clear and that guides our decision making. There's the 15-year strategic plan with the 5-year stages, and that's considered in our everyday work, but it's reviewed each time at the annual planning day. That 15-year strategic plan, as you'll see, is quite broad. It's quite big picture, and so that's broken down into a 3-year strategic plan. And then we have our results-based accountability framework. And yes, we are nerdy governance, strategic planning nerds. But it sounds like a lot. When I put it up there like that, I think, gee, it sounds like we have a lot of documents and a lot of planning. But actually, when you think about it, our vision, mission, and values don't change. They're there and they're quite stable. And the 15-year strategic plan is there and it's reviewed, but is an overall direction. So that it's really only redeveloping the 3-year plan every 3 years. And the results-based accountability framework is something that's relatively new. We're still getting it in place in our organisation, but that's a organisation-wide monitoring and evaluation system that feeds information back up to the board, but also to our funders and donors, and that's very much operationalised. So that's not the work of the board. We receive those reports though, and we contributed to the setup of that process. And so this is what the looking at the roadmap again of where we are. And as you can see that it is more detailed in the closer years. So in 2007, they were looking 5 years into the future, and they were setting things like resolving the direction and decisions on childcare model. So what is our niche in childcare? How do we make it financially viable? So that's the kind of detail we had for 2012. But 2022, getting more into, we want to have strong research, advocacy and community influence. We want to be building networks for young women and women. So it is a bit broader by the later years. And as we get closer to it, we'll be putting some more detail around what we want to be doing in those years. So this is a look at what our 3-year strategic plan looks like. And as you can see, it's a lot more detailed and focused. We've got about 7 of these key bold points with the details below. So in women influencing, leading and deciding, we've got the specific goal of expanding our advocacy work and playing a greater role in representing issues of concern to women and disadvantaged families and individuals. So by the time you get to our 3-year plans, we are getting a lot more specific, but it does fit within that 15-year framework. So in reflecting on the plan, we did that at our annual planning day this year. As you could see, we hit 2012. So that was the 5-year milestone. So it had been 5 years since the organisation first wrote its 15-year strategic plan. And we had a board that had only our executive director was the only board member who had been there for the planning process when we sat down to review how we were going against the 5 years. So we had senior management team members come and give presentation to us on where we were against the 5-year goals, and we had met and exceeded many of our goals, and it was a really great day of reflection of where the organisation had come to in those 5 years. I think that's really important about your strategic plan. It gives you the opportunity to celebrate successes as well. We talked to former board members around where they saw the organisation having come with the strategic plan. So they're now not on the board anymore. I said, when you look at what the organisation's doing, when you hear about how it's going, do you see the strategic plan reflected in that? and people said very much so. So some examples were seeing pilot projects that really spoke to areas of the roadmap. So for example, we talked about wanting to have greater connection with Indigenous community and culturally and linguistically diverse communities, and so we'd had some projects around, for example, an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander touch football day for Reconciliation Week. So that was an example of a project they saw. Look, we can see that there's movement in that area. Another one was supporting older women, and there'd been a pilot project around women who are transitioning through retirement. The board members sort of noticed that a lot of times the framework was there and the ideas were there in the strategic plan, but they were almost kind of surprised at what came up. So for example, the 15-year plan starts talking about more sophisticated communication and better use of technology. We've got quite an active Twitter presence and Facebook, but none of those things were even remotely on the board agenda in 2007. So we had that idea that we wanted to do best practice in communication. We had that idea we wanted to use IT better, but we didn't know exactly what that would look like on the ground. And we also had an online mentoring program that was also making use of IT. Finally, another example was our strategic direction to really diversify our funding sources. So the director said you could really see that had happened through investing in a corporate partnerships officer and receiving grants from other philanthropic organisations. We also talked to current board members around the 15-year strategic plan, because I would have people say to me things like, well, don't you feel locked in? Don't you feel stuck? And I thought, well, I've never felt like that, but maybe other board members do. But actually there's a really positive response when I talk to people about the 15-year strategic plan. They said a lot of people who'd come from strong business backgrounds said, well, it makes sense. You know, it was really gave me confidence when I saw your organisation had that. And other people just talked about feeling really connected to both the past and the future through that kind of long-term plan.
This is a picture of Rebecca Vassarotti, who on Friday had her last day as our Executive Director. Very sad, but exciting for her as well. And so just to look at what this all meant from her perspective, one of the major developments in the last 5 years for the Y has been our affordable housing project, and there have been a few other people that have talked about their work in affordable housing here at this conference. But we have a 5-bedroom house for older women who aren't eligible for public housing, so they might earn just a little bit too much to qualify for public housing, but they also don't have the capacity to enter into the Canberra rental market, so we try and fill that gap in between. And in relation to that, our ED at that time, Rebecca, said, the affordable housing stuff is a great example. When I started talking to our partner organisation, I had no idea of what the options were and how we would go about it. But the strategic directions provided the guidance to start the discussion, and now we have phase 1 of the project, the affordable housing project. So the strategic plan has also affected how we do our reporting, as Ruth mentioned earlier. So at that time, the board reports were based on the strategic plan, and then we transitioned into a whole of organisation monitoring process, which is the results-based accountability that we spoke about. Another question that we asked Rebecca was how the staff responded to the 15-year strategic plan idea, and she said, the staff seemed to react positively. We tried to involve them in the process, and as the work or short-term planning didn't change significantly, it was something that could be integrated relatively seamlessly in the organisation.
I do really like a quote there that talks about how empowering the strategic plan, the long-term strategic plan was for the executive director. And I mentioned to Jo earlier that when Rebecca announced that she'd be resigning, and she had been our executive director for 10 years and had really grown and developed the organisation. And as chair, you kind of have that moment where you just hold on to the table and go, oh, here we go. But the first thing we did as a board was sit down and look at our strategic plan. And that was that sort of anchor for us to say, okay, well, you know, we're going to lose our amazing executive director, but we need to recruit someone who can continue on the next 5 years of this plan and to help us deliver that. So you have a very strong continuity in the organisation, which I'll talk about again in a moment. And so, yeah, as a board, the plan gives you that long-term perspective. So some of the challenges around having a long-term strategic plan, part is that it's that investment that's required to set it up. A lot of work did go into it. But one of the board members pointed out to me that it's the same as for a short-term plan. If you're going to do a 1-year plan or a 3-year plan, you need to research the context, you need to look at the landscape to know the environment, the opportunities and threats. But the longer term vision really pushes you to get a deeper knowledge about the possibilities and the resources and the context. She said that for them, a longer term plan really pushed them to be more thorough in what they did. So it wasn't a light kind of, oh, we'll just do it in a year or 3 years. It was like, we've got to take this seriously. This is a 15-year plan. It can be difficult to communicate and operationalise a long-term plan. And so in interviewing Rebecca, our executive director, she said the biggest challenge has been to keep talking to staff as we work through. For me, I was there at the start, so it seems self-evident how everything we do is connected to the strategic plan. But when new people start, it can be hard to tell others within the organisation. 5 years is a long time. And so she reflected that one of the things that she felt that she could do more of was really communicating that long-term plan to new staff members. Having said that, when I visit the YWCA offices to go in and either for a board meeting or I go in to sign papers, I see that that picture you've seen, that roadmap, is actually on the desk of the executive director and all of the senior management team. I'll walk in just to say hi and that picture is there. So it is very clearly communicated. But we talked about maybe doing more to operationalise it, to have operational plans in the future. A plan needs to have a good balance of clarity and flexibility. So you don't want to feel locked in, but you also don't want it to be too vague. And I think the example that Joe gave about our affordable housing project was another example of how we had a good balance there. So we knew we wanted to do work around older women. Our demographic research has shown that Canberra has an ageing population, and as a provider of homelessness services, we saw the increasing problem of older women, older single women having difficulty finding accommodation. We also knew that we wanted to invest our resources in a sustainable way, that we needed to look at something that might have financial returns for the organisation. And so those goals came together in the affordable housing project. But there are a lot of benefits, even though there are those challenges. So as I mentioned, it helped to give the organisation some stability. There were no board members who were involved in the development of the strategic plan still on the board, and we had 5 one-year board chairs in a row, and that's actually something quite common for our board, is to have a chair that's only there for a year because of our 3-year term. People get to know the board, have a year to consolidate, and then become the chair. And so they said that kind of turnover could really see a strategic plan disappear if there's no champion of it. But actually it really helped with the stability, and once it was in place, people very much accepted it, and it remained there. I did love some of the things the board members said around how important they felt the strategic plan was. So flying by the seat of your pants is not conducive to outcomes was one that I'm going to try and remember in the future. If you don't have a strategic plan, you can be dependent on personalities and loud voices was one comment. So saying the strategic plan gives you a framework for decision making, your vision and values give you a framework for decision making. So it's actually not about who's the loudest at the table. It's what idea responds best to that framework that you have. You can get too swamped by temporary arguments and immediate situations if you don't have a longer term view, and you end up dealing with the urgent and not important rather than the important but not urgent. So these were things that the board members told us that they felt were particularly important. But I think this last quote about being agents of your own destiny is probably something that will resonate with a lot of people, and saying that there's so much change within the sector. There's a lot of fundamental questions about the sector and how it will evolve. Organisations cannot afford not to do long-term planning. Without it, they'll either not exist or there'll be an organisation that the board doesn't recognise anymore. It might not be a problem, but you want to do that in a considered way. We need to be clear about the role and the vision and imagine ourselves beyond specific bits of funding that are available. And a board member said, look, strategic planning is really an opportunity to be proactive and engage with your community and creative. And I think another positive outcome was that the strategic planning left us very well placed to do the results-based accountability work. So with more pressure coming from our funders and from government to show the impact of what we do, a good strategic plan helps you have the framework to develop a good monitoring and evaluation system.
So Ruth and I had a bit of a discussion about what are the key things that we would really stress to everyone in this room if we could. And the first of those is that planning needs to be everyone's job, not just the job of one person. So obviously the ED or the CEO will play a really important role in the development of the plan, but it really does need that buy-in and involvement from the entire group.
When I was doing some of the interviews for executive directors, one of the people who was kind of talking to me about how we were doing the process and what we were doing sort of said, oh, but you'll have a new strategic direction now, won't you? Because you've lost your long-term ED. And I said, well, we've got our strategic plan, we've got our 15-year vision. She said, oh, but, you know, the strategic direction comes from the executive director, doesn't it? And I said, oh, no, you know, it's very much from the board, and it's very much developed by the board. And she said, oh, okay. And I had started questioning that myself. I'm like, how much did that 15-year plan come from the executive director? And then I started chatting to board members, and they're like, well, she was there and she was very supportive and she was very involved, but she was on mat leave for some of it. So I think that really does speak to the fact that it was, you know, a group's kind of decision.
And in fact, one of the quotes that we have from one of the directors in the interview said that it was very much a plan of the whole board and that no one person got their way on everything, which is really important. The other point is really about, you know, a strategic plan is fantastic, but it's only one part of the picture. So our 15-year plan and scenarios gave us the context to have that discussion. Our vision and values provided us with the basis for the decision making around that. And together, those elements really made decision making and continue to make decision making a lot easier for our board. One of the other directors that we interviewed said that it was never intended to be prescriptive. We knew it would shift over time, and certainly you'd need to redo the analysis at some point, hint, hint, in the future and the plan for the next 15 years. And lastly, it's to recognise that planning is an ongoing process, and that the process is often just as important as the outcome itself. So one of the things that Ruth and I have talked about with other directors is that undertaking an exercise like this gives people the space to think, ask questions, reflect and dream about where they would like to see the organisation down the track. And it's about setting the compass for our organisation and really clarifying that vision for all of our directors.
So I hope this presentation's been useful for you, but I have to say it was actually really useful for us to take that time to really look at how we came to have the plan that we have, and particularly in starting to think about, well, we've done the first 5 years, we're moving into the part of our long-term plan where we don't have as much detail, so what do we need to start considering for when we do our next round of strategic planning? We've got a few minutes left, and we'd really like for you to talk to the person next to you or behind you or wherever you can get to, and let them know what your organisation has in place for strategic planning, and what you use and what kind of ideas you might want to share with them, or anything that you feel that you'd like to do differently. So if you could please take a moment to have a chat. Does anyone have anything that they'd like to report back? Were there any particularly unusual strategic planning processes? Was there anything anyone would like to share with the room from that? Yes.
My colleague here, Jim, has an organisation that's been going for 75 years without a strategic plan, and they're just starting to do one.
Wow. It's never too late to start. Was there something in particular that led you to do that? Has something happened that you've said now we want to...
governance training to the board that made us aware that we should have.
Yeah, that's great.
And after today, we'll think probably further out, I think, than the 5 years that I'm talking about.
I think too, when you've been in place for 75 years, you can have that kind of depth of history there that makes you confident you'll continue the future. It's great. Sorry, just over there. Yep.
Hi. I can see how having a 15-year strategic plan can give you guys a sense of security given the uncertainty now, and that would be valuable to you now. But according to the science of training, so like looking at Darwin, Charles Darwin, he didn't say it's survival of the fittest, or those with the fittest governance kind of principles. He said it's the ones that are most able to perceive changes in their habitat and adapt to those changes. They're the ones that survive over time when he looks at the data. So if we map that across to a foresight, scenario planning situation, how are you guys going to plan to learn over that 15 years? That's what's really, in my mind anyway, going to give you guys the adaptive capability is your organisational learning, and I'm wondering what your planning is around that.
Yeah. Do you want me to
Go
that
for
one?
it.
So there's a few answers to that question that I've got coming up while you were talking. One of those is that really we do see ourselves very much as a learning organisation, and that's been part of implementing a results-based accountability framework. So that gives us very good data on what our programs are doing and how they're going, and it means that we have a greater depth of knowledge in reviewing that. So that process of getting information, assessing how we're going and adapting is very much in place across the whole organisation. So that's sort of at the operational level. At the strategic planning level, we do review this every planning day. We do sit down and say, well, okay, we did our 2012 reflection, but now we start looking at 2017. And so every year we look at 2017 and go, has something happened in there that's changing in our environment? Do we need to adapt it? So the framework is there and that doesn't change, but we do continually scan the environment and adapt that there. And the final point I guess I'd make in relation to that is in 2007, the board said, what we want to do is look at our direction and our decisions around childcare and how we can make that viable. At that time, we didn't know that ABC Learning was going to collapse. We didn't know about the major changes that were about to happen in the childcare sector. We didn't know about the really big changes that are happening in how it's regulated and in the qualifications required for childcare staff. What that decision to resolve our directions meant that it was something we were really paying attention to. We looked at the literature around childcare and children in care and decided that we were going to reduce our ratios because that was part of good quality childcare. And then after that, 6 months later, 12 months later, then the regulations came in that said we had to actually reduce our ratio. So we saw that coming, and part of that was paying attention to that change. And really part of that decision was around how is childcare for us a mission-based business? How does it connect to our values? Our niche, when we talked about that, it was really about community-based childcare, so we don't go for tenders in workplaces. We don't see that as part of our work. And we have a very strong family daycare work that enables women who wouldn't otherwise work outside of the home to earn an income. So I think it's that saying that you have these strategic directions set, but you are constantly reviewing and revising where you are. So hopefully that answers your question.
Just to add to that quickly, on our board we also have a really strong culture of being aware of what's happening in the sector. So it's kind of why Ruth and I are here this weekend. And we really take an approach of being aware of risk management, and risk management being something that we integrate into our monthly board meetings. We talk about what's going on. If there's a big change coming up, chances are that there's one of us or many of us on the board that are aware of that. And so our strategic planning isn't just about what's happening internally and where we want to go as an organisation in isolation. It's really about looking at the sector, looking at what's happening in the state and territory government level, and then planning accordingly and reviewing that regularly.
I think any idea that strategic planning, even a long-term plan, can be set and forget is dangerous. It's very much about continual review. I saw some other hands up. Was there any further questions? Sorry, just down the front.
One of the strengths of our organisation that I represent is it's a college, and annually we review our strategic plan with a consultation day, but we don't limit it to the board. We give ownership to students, P&C, parents, teachers, staff, a lot. And we found in these annual reviews, not only has it refreshed the community's idea of what we're doing with our strategic long-term plan, and it's been reviewed, refreshing, will change circumstances, but we're also giving them ownership of it. They're getting input into it annually, and so it's a living, breathing thing that keeps going. So that's a very, very important thing I'd recommend, that these annual consultation days have the right stakeholders there, and it's amazing what comes from them. Our best ideas have come from our students.
That's great. It's a fantastic idea. Thanks for sharing. Just behind.
I like it being a roadmap because it's a bit about keeping us top of mind, but also subliminal for you. So if you were going around Australia, eventually getting to Darwin, you would be driving on doing your own thing every day. But as soon as some story about Darwin comes up, you go, hang on, there's floods up here, or the beer can regatta's on in July, or as you see that exit turn to something else popping up, you go, oh, that's important to you, get your cars. So having it on the CEO's desk all the time, where people see it for the 5 years and 10 years and 20 years, etc., you can actually sort of snapshot little things as they come up, saying that is important to you. Look at that again and see how that might fit in.
How it goes, yeah.
My observation of lots of strategic plans around the place is this bit about how tangible and intangible some of the goals or targets are, where sometimes it is to engage more or respond to or seek out or increase without putting a fixed number on it. The alternative is sometimes the accountants in the organisation will have really hard targets. It's a 15% increase in revenue and a 22% increase in memberships, etc. So getting the balance right where there is something that is quite achievable and that again can be modified each 12 months and you have more evidence as to how you travel.
And I think for us, that's something that works quite well with that tiered planning structures, that your 15-year strategic plan can be broader and can be bigger picture, and whereas our monitoring and evaluation framework, our results-based accountability, is getting quite down into nitty-gritty with numbers. So
Yeah, and measurable objectives at that level.
yeah. Anyone else with a question or a comment that they want to share from their organisation?
When are you going to plan your next 15 years? You're not going to wait until 2020?
Not at all, no. And in fact, doing this process of really consulting with the former board members to find out how they went around the process, really got us thinking about when we're going to do the next set of planning. We do have a new executive director starting in a couple of weeks' time when she gets back from leave, and so very much a consultation with her as well around when she feels is the next time to start doing it. But I think we have to 2017 is quite clear on this one. This 2013 is the last year of our 3-year plan, so we're going to need to develop our next 3-year plan, and probably once that's done, then we'd be looking into revising 2017, 2022, and then pushing that out to 2027. So not concrete plans in place yet, but definitely that sense in the organisation that we've hit the first 5 years and we've got that next 5-year milestone coming up. Any other ideas around methodologies for strategic planning or anything people would like to share?
Yeah, I know of one in the States which is really quite good. It's called Collaborative One, and basically every morning small teams, it's based on agile
programming, yeah.
And small teams get together, have a face-to-face meeting, but it's stand up, and it's only 5 minutes or something like that. And basically each person fires off what they're going to be doing that day, what they're intending to do that day. And that's done daily. Then once a week they have a dynamic steering, which is like a weekly strategy meeting. And then once a month they have a governance meeting with all the stakeholders. And so they've got really nice systems for information flow up
Yeah.
and down.
Sounds great.
And fast iterations.
Yeah,
You're not having 2-hour meetings every day. They put nice parameters to cause it to happen, to conversation be focused.
to check that one out.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I like the idea of stand-up meetings. It's good. It's really good.
Gets everyone out the door. Great. All right. Well, please do come and chat to us in the breaks around our board traineeship program.